So thank you very much again for having accepted my invitation. Actually, you graciously accepted that we talk about your works, but also the focus of the attention. What the book that caught my attention, which was Post-Truth Society.
Yes.
Equally, the book on comedy was fascinating for me. I mean, the topic and the way you deal with the project. Aside from that, I also happened to find the book on liminality, this book, Permanent Liminality.
Yes.
Right, yeah. So if you don't mind, I have a brief introductory note about you, and then we start dealing with the questions.
Okay.
So, Árpád Szakolczai, if I pronounce your name correctly.
Quite fine, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, we read on his university website that my work focuses on social theory, historical sociology, and political anthropology, in particular on historically and anthropologically oriented social theory. Its focus is to reassess the links between Europe, modernity, and process of globalization, which is analyzed using concepts developed by anthropologists and focusing on the long-term historical conditions and effects of religious and cultural developments, situated broadly within the approach of Max Weber, but going substantially beyond by incorporating the sociology of Renaissance and extending to the role of cultural processes like the rebirth of theater. Until 2021, you held the sociology chair at University College Cork, Ireland. From 2009, you were the acting head of department. In the course of your academic life, you published numerous books, journal articles, and conference papers, including some of them Post-Truth Society, A Political Anthropology of Trickster Logic, A Political Sociology and Anthropology of Evil, Tricksterology, From Anthropology to Social Theory, Walking into the Void, and Permanent Liminality and Modernity. So again, my pleasure talking to you. And the first question, Arpad, is what is, if you want to talk to the general audience, what is political anthropology for you?
Well, that's a very good question. And I must start by adding that I have just finished a book which is entitled Political Anthropology as Method. So it's not the methods of political anthropology, but political anthropology as method. And coincidentally, I'm now editing an encyclopedia of political anthropology. So your question really touches the heart of what I'm doing. And so what I can say about political anthropology is that, first of all, political anthropology is not just sort of my interest, but there is a group of scholars which you might have encountered through my websites or otherwise. And there is a journal called International Political Anthropology, which is edited by, or which was founded by Agnes Horváth, whom I know very well and who is in the next room, but one. Harald Vidra, who is a professor of politics in Cambridge University, and Björn Thomassen, who is an anthropologist and is a professor of social sciences in a general sense in Roskilde University in Copenhagen. And so what we mean, and I'm talking about, in that sense, this group of scholars and several others who are, associated with this undertaking, is not simply a field within anthropology as a discipline. So there is anthropology as a discipline, and then there is economic anthropology, legal anthropology, anthropology of religions, and political anthropology. That's not what we mean. That's one element of that. But what we were trying to mean, and really this is the project which Agnes Horváth and not myself launched back to 15, 20 years ago, and then one can talk about the history of that, where the idea was somehow to capture about the contemporary modern human condition as a general condition. So it is connected to all of these things about globalization and democratization and so on. So it's a political dimension of what it means to be human in this increasingly strange and increasingly, crazy and absurd world. Now, this is not so new in a certain way. because the absurd with Camus and Kafka, goes back to a long way. That kind of, there's something absurd about this world. But I think that this absurd reached another level after the collapse of communism, and the recognition, which at least dawned on us increasingly, that somehow it's not the end of history at all. It's not a new world that finally, after communism and the end of dictatorships and the victory of democracy, but there is something very, very strange about all of this. And really what this field, political anthropology, tries to capture, and this is why it has these 3 or 4 different elements, that it addresses certainly social theory, historical oriented social theory, Weber, Foucault, Nietzsche, so on. It addresses anthropology, cultural or social anthropology, Victor Turnell, Marcel Mauss, Gregory Bateson, I can list a number of others. But it also addresses classical political philosophy, back to Plato and Aristotle. And it even addresses anthropology and linguistics. So it is somewhat close to this American kind of anthropology, if you are familiar with the American anthropology, when there is anthropology, physical and cultural anthropology together with archaeology and linguistics for a specific American reasons, and actually for other specific American reasons that is not oriented to classical philosophy and long-term history, but there is a specific American reasons for that. But we would like, if possible, to take it up. And actually, I organized with colleagues a BA degree in Cork around this, political, anthropological, and American vision of anthropology, except that I had to retire because of the COVID things. So it was a very long answer, but it's a complex field. So this is what we mean by anthropology: this complex interdisciplinary field, which is not just another discipline that we try to discover and professionalize, but it's somehow which is an interdisciplinary area which addresses fundamental and meaningful questions.
So if I'm not wrong, I mean, if I can interpret that, and also equal to that, your focus on liminality, could we claim that liminality is sort of, let's call it, inherent in political anthropology?
Certainly. Liminality is one of the most fundamental concepts or terms, and the other is the trickster. These are both, so this is why it's political anthropology, and this is why the anthropological element is very important, because liminality and the trickster were terms developed by anthropologists working inside anthropology. And actually one of the reasons why Agnes and Björn founded that journal is that they wrote articles which they couldn't publish because anthropology journal said that, well, this is not really anthropology, this is social theory. And social theory journal said that, well, this is anthropology, trickster, liminality, these are not concepts for social theory. And so they said that, wait a minute, something is wrong there. And so they organized this journal, International Political Anthropology, partly to publish these articles which are anthropologically based, but which are social theory, not just simple anthropology, and which address the contemporary modernity.
Right.
So yes, you are right. Liminality is a fundamental term, because liminality is a term which captures transitions, transformations, crises all together, in between situations, in the broadest possible manner, and which helps us to understand that the kind of transition and transitionality in which we live is not simply a transition to modernity or a transition to democracy or a transition to some kind of fixed new world in which everything will be efficient and everybody will be happy, but it has this strange kind of transitionality when this transitionality increasingly becomes endemic. And worse than that, it is used in all kinds of ways to keep people suspended with the promise of something better coming. I mean, that was communism, you know, something better is coming. That is, you know, currently the technological managerial elite who is telling you that, oh, comrades, it's all fine, just be with us. This is the COVID, our reading of the COVID issue. And there is a book that is just coming out in December, again, in the same series of contemporary liminality by the same people about, you know, how to use disease as a particular kind of emergence or as a particular kind of liminal condition to really to brainwash people and to push through a kind of technological, economic, managerial, bureaucratic development which otherwise would be resisted tooth and nail. So how to abuse liminality, if you want, use and abuse.
Right. I mean, I really try to understand your project in its entirety, and but again, I ask myself, how do you differentiate your project, as I said, in its entirety or from its inception, from people like Michel Serres or even or even Gilles Deleuze. You know, Deleuze is a person that definitely writes about in-betweenness, and his method of writing is rhizomatic, which, I mean, the priority of politics to ontology is evident in Deleuze. How do you differentiate your project from those, from the likes of Deleuze?
Okay, no, that is an interesting question, because in a way, we don't. I mean, Michel Serres, for example, is a central figure that I wrote extensively. I mean, even in Post-Truth Society, I have a chapter on Michel Serres. So Michel Serres is fundamental for this project. Deleuze is also important. In many ways, I have problems with Deleuze's project associated with desire and a kind of Freudism and so on, which I think was excessive. And if you remember that this was the point in which Michel Foucault actually was again fundamental, also distanced himself in some kind of way to Deleuze. But you know, my answer is, and this is again how I conceive of political anthropology, that it's not that I differentiate my project. It's not that I try to, which is very fundamental both to German and French academic life. This is how, for example, Alessandro Pizzorno, who was a colleague and an old friend, told me how French academic life is, that, you know, you define yourself and this is you, and then you know, shoot left and right, above and below to everybody saying that this is you. And this is exactly how we do not proceed.
All right.
That is to integrate as many people as possible. And in this way, if we don't simply just follow one road, Weberian sociology, or follow Foucault, or follow Serre, or Bateson, or whoever, as a kind of sect that this is what we follow, or defining ourselves as the road, we try to bring in as many interesting thinkers, sociologists, anthropologists, historians, political scientists, as many as possible. And in this way, we occasionally discover that, well, there is something wrong with this person here or there. And which doesn't mean that we'll be then better than anybody, which makes no sense. But somehow we'll bring in as many interesting ideas as possible and sort of act as a kind of, how to put it, fertilizer of intellectual undertakings, bringing together people who maybe wouldn't know themselves otherwise.
Right.
So that's our central point, not to define ourselves in contrast to Michel Serres or Foucault.
Right, sure. I mean, I admittedly, Deleuze is also not a person who constantly negates. Deleuze is a person who bases his philosophy on andness. I mean, I like adding, not on negating.
Yeah. No, and he's very important.
Right. But I mean, there are many things that I can, I have to admit, there are many things that I learned from your project, and also there are many things that I like to ask the question, but because of the time limitations, I try to be like, to follow the steps that I predicted for today. Another interesting that I want to know about is that your focus on the figure of Trickster. I mean, again, people like Michel Serres, they focus definitely on the figure of Hermes. But like you talking about on Trickster, you begin even the clarification on Trickster logic in the beginning of the book, Post-Truth Society. I quote you, I gained the feeling that the new world that was coming into being in the new millennia on the back of an ever increasing globalization, Europeanization, a neoliberal managerialism, taking over universities and gaining increasing inroads, even in Ireland, had astonishing affinities with my old world, and so was bound to become a brave new world. Such perception was first given expression in a talk entitled The Social Logic of Communism that I gave on 24 January 2008 in my own department, a social logic, which I now call Trickster logic. Could you please elaborate, like in a very rudimentary way, what is this Trickster logic that makes you or convinces you that it is not that far from communism? You know, it's interesting that you say that what is happening in neoliberalism is not actually, despite its facade, it's not really different from what happened in communism.
Yes, it's that is very important, and of course it's different in several ways. But this underlying logic, which I call Trickster logic, is what is the same and what is the most dangerous and really upsetting thing about it. Okay, now so Trickster, that's the second term after liminality. Now, Trickster actually, and our knowledge, and here I'm talking about our, again, International Political Anthropology Group knowledge on the Trickster, is really started from, again, Ágnes Horváth, that I already mentioned. That with Ágnes, we wrote a book in 1989 in Hungarian that was translated into English on the Communist Party apparatus. And then a few years later, Ágnes started to work on her PhD, and he wanted to work on the speeches of communist leaders. That is, what is the way the speeches and the discourses, if you want, of communist leaders had an effect. And she was told by everybody, oh, sure, you have to study Max Weber and charismatic leadership. And she said that, no way, these communist leaders were not charismatic. I mean, Fidel Castro may be considered as charismatic, but look at Leonid Brezhnev, if you remember him. Is he charismatic? Or even previous? No, it's not about charisma. Or Rákosi, the Hungarian leader, but there is something about them. And so she was trying to find an approach when she didn't get any help from her advisors, and they were very famous figures because she has a PhD in the European University Institute, and fully on her own, she discovered in various ways, that doesn't matter, this anthropological figure of the Trickster, and she said, that's it. These leaders, communist leaders, fascist leaders, you name them, they are tricksters, not as a labeling device that they are whatever, but tricksters in the specific anthropological and mythological sense, in which anthropologists and mythologists developed this term and then came to use it in various kind of ways. So that was the first step, identifying the trickster as a central figure for contemporary understanding. Now, the second step was that when she was trying to use that term already in the 1990s and published some works, and then 2000 and so on, she noticed that the way people use that term around her, you know, using her idea, didn't use it in the right kind of way because they used it to label people. So again, Trump, a trickster, Boris Johnson, a trickster. And there is something in it, but, and you know, that came later, but earlier there was similar, Berlusconi, a trickster, and you name it. And she said that it's, you know, that's not right, because the point is not just to label figures, and because then you can tell anybody is just a trickster, but somehow to identify the figure, but also the way in which the figure is acting. And this is how she was coming up with this idea of a trickster logic, and I take it from her and using it in my own book. She also wrote various books, and two of the books you mentioned we wrote together, especially the Tricksterology book, which is Tricksterology, it's Trickster knowledge, Trickster logic. So it's about that. So what is this particular kind of logic, which seems logical, but which indeed is just a trickster way, or a trick by which people can be sort of magically, if you want, enchanted, and led into a kind of road which leads to their destruction. And central elements of this trickster logic, which we are on the process of using and developing, are economic logic, this idea of mutual benefits and advancing to mutual benefits, technology, the entire logic, technologic, again, the logic is there. Economic logic and techno logic, they are trickster logics. They are not human logics. And this is why trickster logic is opposed in my book and in Agnes's book to the Charis logic or the gift logic, which is a very fundamental anthropological term, Marcel Mauss. So for us, Marcel Mauss is not talking about primitive exchange, like Polanyi is misreading, fundamentally misleading Marcel Mauss. No, Marcel Mauss is saying that any social life is based on Charis or gift logic. If it isn't, then it's a kind of trickster logic. And to claim that, well, we all have our interest and we have to follow our interest, that's nonsense. Because what interest do we have, which is not to the benefit of others? Because our interest is the interest of a family, but a family is a large group of people, a family of a community or anything. It's not an interest which can be identified and pitted against somebody else and then resolved in some kind of bargaining process. But it's the recognition of our participation in many things.
Right.
In the world, in nature, and so on.
Right. Sorry to interrupt you. Because ideas come to me, and I just
absolutely.
like to ask: do you think that can we attribute, because you abundantly and also beautifully talk about this contrast? I mean, of scarcity. I mean, between scarcity and generosity. Let's say scarcity and gift. Yeah. Can I conclude that one of the main characteristics of trickster is to see the world or to display the world based on a scarcity?
Based on scarcity.
Right.
Absolutely. You see, this is what Louis Hyde says. Now, Louis Hyde, again, I have a chapter in my book on Louis Hyde. He's a quite well-known and very, very important and very good American, actually a kind of outwriter, poet, with a sociological MA as well. And Louis Hyde understood that scarcity is a trick. And this every economist, but I have a PhD in economics actually, so I know my economics. They would tell you, but everything is scarce. And I say, this isn't true. Nature is generous. Everything is abundant. But of course, it doesn't mean that everybody can have all the time everything, but that's nonsense. So scarcity applies a nonsensical logic as the foundation of life. One has to realize that the presumed truth and base of economics, that every good is scarce, is a kind of not aporia. It's a trick, and it is not true, because it depends on a perspective, and it's a perspective which starts by exchangeability, and which presumes a kind of universal perspective, but we are not universal. What it means is that, no, all of us live in a concrete place, at a concrete time, in a concrete setting, in a concrete family, and so on, and so on, and so on. And it doesn't mean that we all want to live in the same place and the same time, and so on. That's a kind of mimetic entrapment. Everybody imitates it. That's another trick, and that's a very important anthropologically based concept: imitation or mimesis. René Girard, Plato, Tocqueville, Tarde. You talked about Deleuze. Deleuze is using a lot of Tarde, and that is Tarde and imitation. Bruno Latour, again, another person belonging. It's a mimetic. Economic theory is based on mimetically imitating what the others want, and then defining this is rational. I can have a good example of that. Italian cars. If you look up, and you can look up the license plates in Italy. 12 years ago, everybody wanted to have silver cars, or 15 years ago. 6-8 years ago, black cars. Now everybody wants a white car. You go around. What is it? Is it rational to have a white car? Absolutely not. Is it rational to have a black car? No, it isn't. These are fashions, fads that come and go. These are imitative. And so these imitative fashions generate scarcity.
And it is noticeably a very important idea in Girard, yeah? And it's embodied
Girard
in
is
envy.
Yes, theater of envy, Shakespeare's book,
Right.
Girard, very, very good on that. A very good example of pointing it out and what is the relevance of Shakespeare to understand modernity. So scarcity means that it's if this kind of mimetic cycles are created, then something becomes scarce because everybody wants the same thing.
A very interesting thing in the book that you also explicitly sort of conceptualize is that in a fashion which is in a way against even the footsteps of Kant and Hegel, which you call them a mistaken idea in idealism, you try to use other writers and to keep yourself inspired. I mean, you asked this question in the introduction to the book, why does one need guides in order to write a book? And I ask this question as simple as it is, why do we need guides to write a book instead of sitting down and speculating?
That's again a very good question, and you really captured what in my according to me, if you want, is wrong in that entire Kant Hegelian idealistic approach, which is the same as in economic theory. This idea that you sit in front of a white paper and then you create a system and explain the world in a kind of system. That is completely wrong. Now, in the new book which I mentioned to you, I discuss again this question of guides explicitly, and why do we need guides? And we need guides exactly in order to help to spark our ideas to move forward. Because if we are just left on our own mind, this supposedly Kantian, Hegelian system-building mind, then we are just circulating in as if what is the word for that, in a kind of void, as if a kind of heating up our own mind in a kind of void, and which just repeats and is entrapped in various kind of circles. So we always need guides. Guides provide at the same time an inspiration and a kind of constraining, in the sense that our inspiration is not just carried away. So it's quite interesting because it's close to the muses in a kind of Greek mythological setting, that the Greeks said that we are inspired by the muses, and the muses are a good way to sort of capture what cannot be captured, because we never know what inspires us. There's no way in which we can understand our way of thinking, because why do we have ideas? Who knows? It's impossible to explain. It's meaningless to explain. For Marx, it was bourgeois and whatever, your class position explained your ideas. For Freud, it's the unconscious. No, it cannot really be explained. But our mind to work needs inspiration, and these guides give you inspiration. You read good books and they give you inspiration, but then they also guide you in the sense that they not just give you wild inspiration, but they orient. It's as if you think about as if a channel. So it's not a flood which goes anywhere, but it's an inspiration. It's a flow, because inspiration moves, but yet it is somewhat canalized. So you use these guides, and this is why one always needs new guides. So for example, I read Michel Foucault's practically everything I could get my hands on. I was in the archives and so on, but now as I have read, I need new guides, because otherwise I would just read again and again Foucault and would be sort of brain damaged by reading too much Foucault. And occasionally I take it up and I reread another passage or so, and then it's again new because I haven't read it in 3 or 4 years. But so one not only needs guides, but always needs new guides.
Perhaps having sorry to interrupt you again. So I mean, perhaps having a supervisor or a mentor in university is a leftover of the tradition that you need a guide to write a book or to write a dissertation. I mean, you cannot rely on your own understanding of the world.
Absolutely. But then you need other guides. You always
Right.
need another guide and another guide. And the problem, one of the many problems in our contemporary university, and this is an older problem than just the contemporary managerialism and so on, is that people just repeat what their supervisors were telling, and then they are already entrapped in a particular kind of narrow agenda, which doesn't mean that they don't have to appreciate their supervisors, but and the supervisor is already a guide to other guides, because the supervisor gives good books to the student, and then the student can select which to read, and then these books guide him to other books as well.
Right.
So it's this is the inspiration and the guidance at the same time.
Some part of the book you explicitly talk about the doing away with the fact that doing away with evil or exorcism is at the heart of enlightenment, as you explained in the book. And you believe that the problem of evil should be reformulated or should be formulated again beyond worn out slogans. I would be thankful if you just sort of elaborate on that. What do you mean by reformulating the problem of evil in our contemporary thought?
I think that's a very, very important question. And in fact, the book is about, I mean, the Tricksterology book is explicitly about evil. I mean, that's the title of the book, Political Anthropology and Sociology of Evil. I mean, that was originally the subtitle, but I mean, that doesn't make much difference. It's the book is about in a way rethinking or reconceiving evil, which exactly doesn't mean to doing away with it as a problem or to pretend that there is an easy solution, because central about the concept or the idea of the trickster is that it is impossible to assume in a way it is impossible to solve. I mean, it goes back to a very important question in social theory and philosophy. Can things be solved, or can human and social life be considered as problems to be solved? That's sort of the Popperian perspective, and it is absolutely wrong as a starting point. I mean, it was very far, and evil is one of those things that it's very difficult to even to capture what is evil, what is the meaning of evil, and but then still it is in a way it is impossible to eliminate. And what the trickster helps us to understand, it's a very important point, is that evil cannot be destroyed, or persons who are evil cannot simply be destroyed, because the very destruction of evil in the logic of the trickster multiplies it. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that the law shouldn't punish people who commit crimes or something like that. That's exactly the point, that evil is not a legal category. Crime and evil are different things. It's like a crime and a sin are different things, and the sin is a delicate issue, because the sin has a particularly religious connotation, and but evil is not simply religious, just as it's not simply legal, or it's not simply social. Again, this is, I think, what we got already into in the last time of trying to capture what is it that we gain by posing the problem of evil through the trickster and through this issue of limitlessness, which is there in the literature about the trickster. So the trickster is a manifold figure with many characteristics, and that's why it is so fundamental for us to understand our own reality. And one of the central elements of the trickster is limitlessness. Another central element of the trickster, which is related to that, it's a kind of failure to respect limits, but respect limits now not in the sense of going beyond, but failing to respect what is accepted as a kind of normal, decent human behavior in a particular culture or in any culture. That's
right.
It's not the same, but and yet it is basically the same.
Yeah, but again, Arpad, sorry to interrupt you, but we see
Sure,
that,
please
I mean, we see that like there is a constant attempt in the contemporary sense, or even day to day, of depicting somebody or something as evil. Like, I mean, we see today, like, I mean, that I mean, in any social conflict, in any political conflict, we see that somebody or something or some country is immediately depicted as evil. And sometimes when I'm talking to my friends, I tell them, I mean, it's quite funny. I think that, I mean, I have this intuition, Arpad, I have this intuition that sometimes living without God is easier than living without evil. I mean, living without, you know, like people need that to find, okay, and to pinpoint or to, you know, like to say that, okay, this is evil.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And it's especially it's difficult to identify where exactly in the media, certainly, but it's not just the media. In that sense, it is not just the media. Although the media, in a way, is limitlessness itself. So the media is a good how to say it, candidate to qualify as a trickster, and therefore it has its inherent evil characteristics. But it's not just in the media, but somehow in our cultures and civilizations, there is a tendency, and it's difficult to exactly pinpoint where exactly it comes. It is easy to pinpoint the Christian idea of the devil, but that's not sufficient to characterize it. But there is this tendency to depict the opponent as evil. And then, of course, the opponent can, of course, often be quite, problematic, because it's just as unacceptable to be completely relativistic and to say that, well, there are two sides to every conflict or every problem, and it's nobody can be blamed or something like that, because there are sometimes clear aggressors or not. So it's not that all sides are equal, but
Right.
It doesn't mean that somebody, and whether that entity can be identified as evil in such a simplistic manner. That is the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to really go to the daily issues, like the political issues, but like, I mean, it's crystal clear that, like, in terms of Putin, he's like aggressive, like he's aggressor, he's like aggressing the territory of another country. It's like, it's like sort of commonplace knowledge that we have about the country being invaded. But at the same time, in depicting Russia as evil is like, as if like we are compensating this need. We just like, like we are, okay, finally we recognize the evil in the world. That is what I mean as an example. Well, of course it is not. I don't want to go to the like concrete daily examples, but that is what I usually receive from media.
Yes. But going back not to the concrete political example, but I want to insist on the media, because the media is a very interesting entity. And there are two ways in which we can see the extremely problematic character of the media. And one is through Hermes, a major trickster figure, and Hermes, hermeneutics, and so on and so on. So Hermes as a figure of communication. Michel Serres, the French philosopher, wrote 5 volumes on Hermes and communication, which is not about Hermes, the trickster, and which is not about evil. Although the 6th book of Serres, which was a kind of corollary of this series, the Parasite, turned out to be explicitly about evil in a way that surprised Michel Serres, and that's an extremely interesting element of this entire Trickster communication problematic that Ser ended up having to discuss evil through Ser and the parasite and communication. So that's one problem with the media, is this hermetic character of the media and of any communication, and especially any instance when human, whatever it is, conversation experiences are somehow interrupted and interfered with and saturated by a kind of third figure who acts as a mediator and the middleman. That's one element of the media, one major problem with the media as a media. The second major problem is this limitlessness of the media, which again is applied. I mean, I have a phone call which I have to reply because otherwise the line is going wrong. Can we stop for a minute?
Yeah, sure.
Pronto? Sì. Sì, ora faccio un'intervista online, allora se molto veloce posso fare, o altrimenti va bene, allora. Un secondo. Perfetto, grazie. Arrivato 872444. Perfetto, grazie, buonasera. Okay, sorry, that was an important and short message, so we can go back.
That's fine. Okay, thank you. Yeah, okay. But my next question is that.
Wait a minute, question.
Do you hear me?
Yeah, I cannot hear you. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I cannot hear you.
Okay, so I mean, like, what is then, Arpad, what is your take on, I mean, you talked about Michel Serres, you talk about the question of evil and parasite, and then what is your take on violence? I mean, evil is normally associated, at least in our thought and our common thought, as with violence, but your analysis of evil isn't based on violence or violent atrocities that are evidently bad, but rather on arrogantly ignoring the limits, especially, as you say, trespassing the limits of death and life. So what is your take on violence then?
No, yes, so certainly violence is an extremely bad. I'm just thinking about whether it's bad or evil, or whether it is the limit between bad or evil, because violence in a way, in any form, is unacceptable, and violence is always a kind of overpassing of the limit. It's a very important question of what exactly is the source of violence. And here, another thinker who I think is extremely important is René Girard, and his point about mimetic violence and circles of violence and mimetic rivalries. And Girard is extremely important because Girard locates violence in this, circles of imitation, which again returns us to the media again. Many things turn back to it, because seemingly the media is just not violent. I mean, evidently, if you watch the television, it's not violent, and yet it isn't true, because the media instigates violence in all kinds of ways by showing images of violence, or simply by generating all kinds of rivalries by the way they present various sides of the matter, or just one side of the matter, and so on and so on. So violence is unacceptable in almost any kind of ways, and the issue is not to justify violence, which can hardly ever be justified, and I don't want to go into the self-defense and this kind of argument, but beyond the issue of violence, there is the mechanisms by which violence is instigated, and that's a very important addition. Here we again return to limitlessness, because basically if things have a certain kind of limits or measure or shape, then violence does not emerge, because people know in a way what is the limits they have to respect in order to avoid these problems of violence. So again, we come back to the question of evil at the level in which these mimetic spirals or mimetic rivalries are sort of started. And it is very important to realize, for example, that war is one of the most irrational issues in the world. So in my reading, it's a very Platonic reading, wars are simply absurd and irrational. Let's just think about, who won in the world wars, basically? Nobody. What meaning were the world wars? I mean, they were enormous, amount of victims and destruction and so on, and for what? And that is interesting, because important questions are not posed really about the world wars, because we still don't understand what it is. I mean, there are all kinds of theories and explanations about capitalism and fascism and whatever you name it, but that's not sufficient in how these wars are spiraling back and forth, let's say back and forth between France and Germany in the more evident case. And it's, at the end, what is it? It's a few, Strasbourg or whatever is it, German or French. And the important point, and then again, we turn to the question of limits. And it's very important that there are, liminal zones between entities. And the wars are always about these liminal zones. And in that sense, for example, Ukraine, again, not to be, it's very interesting, it's a liminal zone, and Ukraine means at the border. Literally, that's what the name means. And if we go to Serbia, that the region where the biggest wars were in, that was again Krajina. And Krajina has the same name as Ukraine. And Krajina is again the zone between the Serbs and the Croatians or something like that. I don't remember now exactly what, but it doesn't matter in that sense, because what it means is that these are liminal zones, and liminal zones are always very, very difficult to define where they belong to, because in a way they belong to nowhere. And these liminal zones in the past were actually no man's lands. That is, like now a border. A border is not just a line, but the border is a no man's land between two countries, whether policed or not, when there is nobody, because that's just the border, except that in real life, then these borders are extended, like there are the borders between the French and the German areas, and you go on, one can go on, where people are who sort of belong in between to one and the other, or to nowhere. So limits are fundamental, and the limitlessness, not respecting limits. What is the meaning of the reality of the limits? That's a very important question. That's why we turn to liminality again, and the trickster and liminality imitation. These are all anthropological concepts which are very fundamentally interrelated.
Interesting. Arpad, methodologically, you're less interested in opposites, as you say, or even the thought of difference, and more in similarities or quasi-similarities, imitations, as you just already mentioned, attractions and disseminations. Can you explain it? And does it not, I mean, like last time I asked you the same question, does it not result in not recognizing differences?
Yes. Well, certainly I wouldn't say that, in the sense of not recognize differences, because like all these rivalries are about differences, or limits are about differences. Limits are differences between different entities, whatever they are, different peoples or cultures, and so on. The issue is not I wouldn't formulate it in terms of the identity difference issue, but for me, the methodologically, and I have just published, I mean, literally yesterday or so, a book on political anthropology as method. So this is what resolves my idea about method as the way, or not method as the scientific method which is to be followed and so on, but about considerations of method, how to proceed. And there, a central term which we haven't yet mentioned, or maybe not in this conversation, is participation, which one is very fundamental. And participation, which is in a way ignored in modern philosophy, and that is my fundamental problem with the kind of modern philosophy, which is focusing on, for example, the neutral observer or the ideal spectator as a kind of ideal moral position, which I don't think it is a good idea, because it's a non-existent position. And if we ignore participation, then we ignore anything which is related to meaning and value and whatever it can capture. So it's participation, and then participation, it doesn't exclude, of course, difference, because one participates, or different people participate in different entities, and then between these different entities and activities, there are limits, but these limits are not necessarily limits of opposition or limits of contradiction, but limits of, again, of difference, exactly. One participates in different circles, and different people participate in the same circle or in other circles. So that's it's participation which really helps to overcome this identity difference issue. And just to go back to the trickster again, now this is a fundamental feature of the trickster, is that the trickster doesn't participate. And this is another extremely important feature of the trickster for us, and this seems to be different from the question of evil, and it is different from the question of evil and limitlessness, but yet it makes the trickster, again, so paradoxically paradigmatic for modernity, in the sense that, again, modern thinking and rationality supposedly is about, again, objectivity, neutrality, indifference, and not participation. So it immediately parallels or brings close the logic of modern rationality to the figure of the trickster. And this is, of course, a very major challenge, but this is the challenge I want to pose to the very heart of what is now considered as rationality, and which is a kind of irrational or meaningless
it's very interesting. Sorry to interrupt you. It's very interesting. Please. When you say that Trickster is inherently a figure that does not participate. Did I capture correctly?
That's the definition of it. Yes.
Can you explain it? It's interesting for me to know more about it. I mean, Trickster doesn't want to participate.
It's not even that it doesn't want to, but the trickster, in the anthropological accounts, anthropological, ethnographic, other accounts, the trickster always comes from the outside, and the trickster does not belong to the community. It's the chapter 1, 2, 3 of our book on the tricksterology tries to explore this question of what it means. But the trickster always comes from the outside, so it's a kind of outsider, which poses the question of where does the trickster belong if it doesn't belong to anywhere. But in all these stories, the trickster sort of just appears out of the blue. There's a very good example for the trickster, and this is the book of Hermann Broch, who is a German author, and he had a book on the trickster, which is called Spell. The spell in English translation. There are two different German translations, and one is the Verzauberung, I think, and other I can't remember. So different German words for the trickster. There are not that many novels of Hermann Broch, and this is an extremely interesting novel, which Hermann Broch started to write in 1934 or so. Evidently, it is about Hitler, but it's not about Hitler in a trivializing manner. And in fact, he abandoned it and then started another novel and then returned to it. An extremely interesting book about a mountain village in which sort of an outsider comes, and then comes another outsider, and what happens there sort of captures this archetypical trickster situation, that the trickster is always an outsider. And so the trickster does not participate. And why the trickster is an outsider? Well, that's another question.
Oh, it doesn't take part, but or doesn't participate, but probably intervenes and influences.
That's the point, and then has to find particular ways of operation in order to gain influence. And this is why the trickster is a joker. Is a storyteller, but the trickster is also an intriguist, or how you say that, plots, plots with one people against others, then with others against ones, and so on, always in the background. Has this underground existence. So there's a Dostoevsky, and these underground characters are also trickster figures, again, technically.
All right. Okay. Interesting. So I go further to the question that, I mean, there's a paragraph in the book that you talk about lying, and you say that lying has infinite varieties. The book certainly cannot capture all the modern versions, all the more so as in our world, many forms of delivering truth also became form of systematic misleading and lying. Would you please elaborate it? What you mean by like lying and the new forms of it?
Yes. No, this is that's another very complex question about the trickster, because at one level, lying is a fundamental feature of the trickster. Again, here Hermes, the Greek figure of Greek mythology, is particularly interesting because Hermes has three characteristics mainly. Hermes is the god of messages. Hermes is the god of commerce. And Hermes is the god who is taking the soul of the dead to the underworld. But Hermes is also a thief. So it's not just the god of commerce, but a thief. Just doesn't simply take the dead to the underworld, but steals the soul of the living. And finally, Hermes is not just a god of language and communication, but also lies. So this is important because Hermes captures these ambivalent features of the trickster, and one of the most ambivalent figures is what is the link between truth and lie, and how can language, which is the tool of talking and understanding, also become almost imperceptibly a tool of lying. I mean, one easy way to say that is that Hermes is the god of translation, for example. And translating, it's easy to mistranslate, and it's easy to act as a translator or a mediator between different languages or different cultures or different entities, and then do it in a way that sort of almost imperceptibly doesn't follow the truth. But then it's more complicated than that, because the issue is not simply a kind of willful and systematic lying, but how can even something which is supposedly true, news, scientific research, data, and so on, be modes of misleading and almost modes of lying, because they are not about what should really be studied, or that they, saturation of communication channels with meaningless facts is a form of lying. There are interesting, rock songs about that, which you might know or might not know. I mean, it might be 30 years or 50 years old. I don't know the most recent ones, but there are many good rock songs which sort of capture this, not lying in the sense of telling things which are sheer lies, but lying in the sense that not talking about what should be done, or ignoring what should be done, or misleading the attention away from what really should be done. And these are the fields of the trickster. So when today, for example, this is again, this is a very political issue, not so right now, but I think it will be again. That's entire COVID kind of policies. It's so an extremely important issue of systematic lying in many different kind of ways. One way was presenting the official rules or the official line as the only meaningful or as the only scientific rule, when it is absolutely not the case, because science, especially in medicine and public health, it's a very delicate issue. So what can scientists say maybe after 15 or 20 years about a a virus or about whatever it is, a vaccination and so on. Once they have done these results, they can say something, and about many things which today are starting from electromagnetic radiation and computers and waves and so on. We really don't know anything because the changes are so quick that it's impossible to test, and we know what it means to test. I mean, we cannot wait 15-20 years, and so what science is, it's a very, very delicate issue. And when politicians and journalists start to argue in the name of science and throw out, what is the word for licenziare in Italian, the dismissed professors and doctors and so on, that they are not scientific, that's an enormous lie. And so lie is a very, very delicate issue, and we are saturated by major forms of lying, even in the official kind of media, when on the one hand, truths and lies cannot be so simply separated, just as what is evil and what is good cannot be so easily separated, but which doesn't mean that we don't have an important duty to minimize lies as much as possible, all forms of lies, when we are again flooded by lies. Yes, and many other things. Yes.
I have like 1-2 questions, and some part of the book has been devoted, and also your project has been devoted and inspired by the concept of gift. And from Louis Heide and his understanding of gift, you add that, I'm quoting you, the implication is that if talent as a gift given is not taken proper care of, is not used in the right manner, the gifted person will not just waste his life, but becomes the greatest enemy of life and the living, a ghost, trickster, or living dead. One of the biggest pillars of the book, inspired by Heide, is a difference between gift consumption and mother consumption, and more importantly, the difference between gift giving and market economy. You add that when people like Friedman insist on scarcity and the importance of the market to produce abundance, people like Louis Heide emphasize the crucial characteristic is not scarcity, but generosity. What is this thought of generosity that is so significant to you?
Oh, well, that's very fundamental. And these words, gift, generosity, magnanimity, in my reading, are the foundations of social life in any culture. And so it's not a kind of wishful thinking. It's not altruism or something like that. No, this is what human life is and is always based about. And again, in that sense, one has to be a Platonist, in the sense that what Plato says is that living the good life is not a choice or so, but it's the only way to live. If somebody doesn't live according to these basic principles, if one doesn't recognize what is good, then one's life becomes wasted. And the major modern, whatever can be characterized, presumed motivations of human life, money and fame and consumption and so on, they are all false things, meaningless, and they lead to the systematic destruction of the life of all. So being generous, it doesn't mean that it's a kind of moral precept which is very nice but nobody takes seriously. But it's the only way to live properly, because this is when one starts to circulate gifts in a broader sense, gifts, attention, kindness, and then it's reciprocated by kindness. While the supposedly rational, which is in fact not rational, just in a kind of modern sense, way of living, of maximizing money and consumption and utility and all these kind of things, destroys the basis of life and renders everybody anxious and what is the word for that? Nervous and stressed and so on and so on and so on. So this logic of gift, charis, generosity is fundamental for social. In fact, this is fundamental for nature. And this is why, the logic of scarcity doesn't apply. And Haidt's book is extremely important, because scarcity is, how to say, it's not a fact of nature, but scarcity is a social construct. Indeed, it doesn't mean that everything is a social construct, because, if you have a peach tree or whatever, an apricot tree, then the tree gives an enormous amount of fruits that you cannot possibly eat, or you or your family or whatever. So you put it away into a whatever compote or to keep it in the future. And the other point is that fruits basically really cannot be traded. That is, what you buy in the supermarket is not fruit, but something which was harvested unripe and then forced to get ripened. And another thing is that then fruit is then treated by gamma rays in order to keep it and to sell it. So what we are surrounded in this modern world is a kind of generalized and institutionalized nonsense, in which we are deprived of anything which is valuable in human life, and which is either comes from the abundance and generosity of nature, or the generosity of human beings. And instead we are enclosed into our own rooms and go to the supermarket, and this is a totally mad way of living. So it is fundamental, and this is why I try to present these guys to Trickster land, to realize that we live in a prison, in fact, or a kind of prison, all of us. This is why Agamben, for example, Giorgio Agamben, a very important thinker, is fundamentally right, and he wrote about that 20 years before this current, COVID madness, and this is just cannot continue, because it's meaningless, because it deprives us of any modicum of a decent life. And it destroys nature as well. So it's a very strange situation in which there are all kinds of problems in all kinds of worlds, but much of these, how to say, it's not that we lived before modernity in a kind of paradise. I mean, there are all kinds of problems always everywhere, but much of the current problems are problems of modernity and problems of various kinds of modernist and modernizing regimes, whether they are communist or capitalist or Shachian or whatever, that generate a terrible amount of chaos, because this entire modernity cannot be fully exported anywhere.
Right. Arpad, I'm just like, because you're talking about Agamben and all these points that you mentioned, I mean, interestingly, I try to sort of connect them to my last question, which is sort of a kind of, I mean, it's like a mixture of question, intuition, observation, comment, whatever you want to call it. Is that, I mean, by the passage of time, I have this impression that critical theory, let's say my question has two parts. Like, by the passage of time, I have this impression that critical theory or critical approaches to life in any sort of it, like in the most cultivated, sophisticated, progressive sense of the word, bears inside itself inherently a sort of a scarcity. I mean, critical theory is based on a scarcity, yeah. And I think that this thought of, I mean, it is something that I have to admit, it comes from Deleuze to me. It's like this is something that I could relate to Deleuze, to Bataille, like all these thinkers. But on the other hand, I can think that even we cannot lament or mourn about a beautiful past that we have lost, because even that is based on a scarcity. Even that implies that there is no generosity now. You know what I mean? So I think I try to be a bit careful that how to apply generosity to thinking, how to think generously, which means that, even I try to be, of course, critical of scarcity in its present mode, as you said, in Agamben or in any other thinker. But at the same time, it means that I don't want to always think of a a lost utopia, or a kind of like a kind of lamenting about a past that is no more there, because that's also not equally generous. It's also, it's based on a scarcity, that we have lost something.
Yeah, I see your point, and you are absolutely right. It's a delicate issue, because on the one hand, it never makes sense to go back. I mean, to go back, it's almost the same thing as if somebody in one's own life, one cannot regret decisions made in the past. One might not have made the right turn, but one loses the sense of living if one laments about the past. Yet, on the other hand, the metaphor of walking is very important, and the metaphor of walking is fundamental for the way and method and the road, because method basically means the way. And the walker knows that if a walker makes a mistake in a road, he has to turn back. So that's one answer, or part of the answer to your question, is that we are now in a situation that we indeed have to go back, not to a lost golden age, whether it was or not. It's not possible, but we have to go back, and we have to unmake much of these modern machinery which really destroys us completely. Now, going back to the question of thinking, because that's the second part of your question, it's a very important question about, because thinking in a way is inherently implies generosity. It goes back to the old question of Plato and the sophists, like so many things again, that the sophists taught for money. And Plato and Socrates didn't teach for money. Now, one can say that today everybody is teaching for money, because if you are not a professor or a lecturer or something like that, then you can't do anything. But that's not the issue, because of course, in the world we live, and unless we just go out of the world into the desert, which was done by some people, and that's another issue, one cannot do that. But yet, it's one thing that one is being paid for teaching and so on, and it's another thing whether one is completely subordinated to that logic and is only chasing grants and so on and promotion, and which is not generous. And one of the big battles really in the university right now, and in academic life, in intellectual life, is basically to force academics to work only for money, and to take that generosity out of it. And that's a very serious issue. Now, the third part of the question, and going back to critique, and that I think you're absolutely right about the very problematic nature of critique at every level, and going back to Immanuel Kant and Descartes and doubt, and critique and doubt, they are so closely connected concerns, because in fact a critical theory is problematic, because a critical theory is only looking for things on the reverse. I mean, and then again, critique can be defined in various different kind of ways, but still the main sense is the same. So critique means somehow to judging and criticizing, and even the idea of judging is something of a problem, because judging is not a question of generosity again. And of course, it doesn't mean that everything goes, or we just talk about anything without any point. But here the central issue is that people were thinking before Kant for hundreds of thousands of years, or hundreds and thousands. And so you don't have to be a critical theorist in order to think. There is something really ludicrous about this idea, which is actually verbatim said by Habermas, that before Kant, that's the Kant and Kant's critics are the foundations of things. They are. We can debate about what exactly they serve anything. Maybe they can make thinking more sharp, but thinking which is more sharp is almost like a weapon, and we don't need weapons which are sharp. We need words which convey a meaning, and that's something very different from a sharp weapon and a sharp concept.
I mean,
so that's not
Arpad,
generous.
yeah, definitely. I mean, even in terms of pedagogy, I think the question of generosity is extremely important. Even here, when I'm talking to friends, like German friends, who are absolutely like critical thinkers and sophisticated and well-read and everything, they are the result of a couple of generous teachers in their schools.
That's exactly the point. Yes, yes.
They
exactly.
are not the result of these, this methodology of critical thinking. They always admit that, okay, if there was not this teacher in my school, or if there were not these couple of teachers or these couple of rencontres, I wouldn't be the person that I am.
That's very fundamental, and I can second it that and any thinker I became familiar with, they were always one or two or more concrete persons as teachers who were not simply conveying a material in a interest-driven critical sense, but who were exemplary human beings in their teaching, and that's very fundamental.
I mean, it doesn't exclude the role of like thinking, but it means that we are made out of these encounters, also these generous encounters that the person has given us more than the teacher is expected to do.
Exactly. That's it's the abundance issue. I think that's there in Deleuze. I think I remember. I don't know him very well, but it's certainly there in Deleuze, and it's there in Louise Hyde and others. It's there in Bergson in a way, and Bergson, of course, is the main source of Deleuze.
Thank you, Arpad.